Filing your LLC is really easy, but doing it wrong could put at risk your personal assets, your business assets, and everything that you've worked for. So you need to learn how to do it the right way the first time. Pretty much every DIY LLC formation that I see has been done completely wrong. Even though you've gotten your certificate of formation filed with the state of Texas, there's a million things that are problems behind the scenes. If you can't answer who's forming the LLC, where, why, and what its purpose is, you're probably not doing just forming in the LLC, you're probably creating yourself a big file of problems. So filing your LLC, like most people think of, filing your certificate of formation with the state is really, really easy, but it's the structure that is really not easy and requires some really high level thinking and planning. And maybe where you're making a mistake in your LLC formation. Now, most business owners, they go hop on a DIY formation website, or they get their buddy to do it, or maybe even their CPA to do it. They don't contact a lawyer, and they don't even think about the structure. They don't even think about what is the purpose of the LLC and how should it be set up in a way to protect me the most. They sit down at their computer, they click through a few forms, boom, it's filed, and they never think about it again. And there's a whole mess of problems behind the scenes. My name is Dustin Lee. I run a business law firm in the state of Texas. We work on business formations, commercial transactions, business disputes, litigation. If you'd like to know more about us, please check the description below. Okay, so in this video, we're going to discuss 4 different topics. The first is, what questions do you need to know the answers to before you even start working on this LLC? The second is going to be, where do you file for formation of the LLC, and where do you need to register it to do business? The third is, how do tax classification, ownership structure, and other formation issues that are behind the scenes issues affect the formation and the documents that you need to prepare. The last thing we'll talk about is the DIY mistakes and errors, sort of pitfalls that a lot of people fall into when they're trying to do this thing on their own. Now, none of the information in this video is legal advice, tax advice, securities advice, or any sort of other advice. It's for general informational purposes only, for your knowledge and information. Now, if you have questions about how to structure, because it is an incredibly complex issue, you should contact a local attorney in your jurisdiction that has a lot of experience in business law, forming LLCs, and properly structuring things. Okay, the first question that you need to be able to ask yourself when you're forming an LLC is, why does the LLC exist? What is its purpose or function? Is it to protect the owners from personal liability? Is it to optimize on taxes? Is it so that you can grow and scale a company? Is it so you can look more professional? You need to be able to figure out what is the purpose or function of the LLC. And if you can't answer these questions, it's probably not time to form yet. The LLC is really just a tool, and the strategy and the structure behind it, that is going to determine what the tool is used for and what the tool can accomplish. So just taking a piece of paper and filing it with the state, it doesn't get you anywhere. You really need to focus on the structure behind the scenes, figure out exactly what the LLC is going to be used for, why it's going to be used, and the optimizations that you need to have to take full advantage of the LLC. Okay, the next question that you need to ask yourself when forming the LLC is, where does the LLC live? Where does it do business, and where is it going to be formed? Now, I'll tell you, most of the time, you're probably just going to want to form the LLC in whatever state you're doing business in. So if you're doing business in Texas, you probably just want to form the LLC in Texas and call it a day. Now, there are some complicated structures where you may form an entity in Delaware or Wyoming or another state for some particular advantage that you want there, and then register that business to do business in Texas. Most of the time, that's more complex than what you need. So for example, that's going to create 2 sets of tax filings, 2 sets of corporate filings, really 2 sets of everything, and the compliance becomes doubly complicated when you're trying to form in one state and operate in another state. And I'll tell you right now, unless you've got a legal team and a CPA team on your side, you're probably already struggling with compliance issues, and you don't want to make those compliance issues doubly complicated by forming in a different state and registering to do business in Texas. So most of the time, cut that complication out and we form in Texas. Now, if you want to talk to a lawyer and get some strategic advice about why you might want to form in a different state and register here, great. but I certainly wouldn't try to do that on your own. And finally, if you're doing business in Texas, even if you have created some sort of complex structure with a holding entity out of state or with the entity actually formed out of state, then you most likely, if you're doing business in Texas, if you're signing contracts in Texas under Texas law, you're probably getting sued in Texas court. You're probably subject to Texas law. And so really, Texas is going to be the venue for you, whether you like it or not. But there may be some strategic advantages to forming in a different state. But for the most part, you're going to want to form in Texas. The next question you're going to want to ask yourself is about the ownership structure. Now, obviously, in a single owner or single member LLC, you're going to be the only owner. It's not really that complicated. But in a multiple owner situation, things get really complicated really fast. You have to figure out what's the optimized way to set up the structure of the entity, who's going to be a manager. Are we going to set it up as a manager managed or a member managed entity? And the big thing is, if you've got more than one owner, the certificate of formation that you're filing with the state really does not contain the agreement between the owners. That agreement is called a company agreement or an operating agreement. Usually it's a very lengthy document that needs to be highly customized to meet the needs of the agreement between the two or more owners. So the big DIY pitfall that you have in multi-owner situations is using a template operating agreement that you just found on the internet. The next question you need to ask yourself as far as the ownership is concerned is, do we need to put this entity into a holding company and have a holding company be the owner? So if this one entity is part of an overall entity structure, where you may have multiple entities, multiple service lines, or multiple properties, you may have one holding company owning multiple LLCs for different service lines or properties. And that's something you really need to think about before you fire up the LLC, because it's a lot easier to structure on the front end than go back and fix on the back end. So you need to keep in mind that ownership is really something that drives voting, it drives profit and loss, it drives the ability to be able to exit or sell this entity later on down the line. So you really shouldn't just willy-nilly take on partners or take on new owners or list, say, family members as owners or managers, unless there's some specific reason. Always ask the question, why am I doing this? What's the reason for this? And have that as part of your internal conversation when you're structuring the entity. So I can tell you from what I've seen, the biggest pitfall is setting up the ownership wrong and not having a thoroughly detailed company agreement or operating agreement to go over what the agreement between multiple owners is. Okay, next. When does it make sense to have a holding company or a trust be the owner? This is when structure starts becoming even more complex, and you really ought to think about talking to an experienced business law attorney. But just some general thoughts that you may be having. When should a trust or a holding company be the owner? Well, like we talked about before, if there are multiple service lines or multiple properties, they're going to be held by individual entities. Maybe you want a trust or a holding company to be the owner of all those individual entities for the different service lines or the different properties that you're going to be offering. If you care about things like estate planning, then maybe the trust makes sense for you to have the trust be the owner. Also, if you're planning having operational assets versus just holding assets for appreciation like real property, then you may want to think about having different ownership structure. But keep in mind, just bolting these on without a real reason or proper legal drafting can be really problematic. It can cause you issues with your tax filings, with your bank, with your vendors, etc. So you have to really be thoughtful and you have to be thorough with your documentation. The next question you need to ask yourself when you're forming an entity is, what is my tax classification going to be? Now, there's a number of different tax classifications you can have across different entity types and across different ownership levels. The main thing that you're going to be looking at is, when you have an LLC, are you going to be taxed in the default way, or are you going to tax as a subchapter as corporation? So the default way, if you're a single owner LLC, you're a disregarded entity. If you're a multiple owner LLC, you're a partnership. If it's owned by a married couple, you can actually elect either way, disregarded or partnership. And then there's actually the subchapter S tax treatment as well. I won't dive into all those now, but just to let you know, that's a question that you need to be able to know the answer to before you file and register the LLC, because you need to know what your tax treatment is going to be and how your taxes are going to be handled. I always recommend that you get a CPA to handle this for you so that you'll know what the best tax treatment is for you. The next thing that we'll talk about is mistakes that I see all the time when people come in with LLC documents that need to be audited. The first sort of classification of mistakes or errors that I see, especially when people did a DIY sort of online formation without any assistance from a lawyer, is timing mistakes. So they actually started contracts, they bought assets in their personal name, and then they formed an LLC after. They didn't move those things over to the LLC, meaning that they're still personally liable on those things. So timing is important. Either form the LLC before you start doing business, or make sure that everything gets properly moved over to the LLC once you start doing business. Another timing mistake that's pretty common to see is when people wait too long to restructure or to look at or audit the DIY formation that they did. So maybe you've gone out, you formed your LLC on your own through a DIY formation service. You really didn't know what you were doing, but you really didn't have any money at the time because the LLC wasn't making any income. So in order to cut costs, you tried to do it on your own. And then all of a sudden, now you're making a lot of money, which is fantastic. But you've never gone back to audit those LLC documents and get them improved to make them more protective and helpful for you. And it's something that you really need to think about if you have done things sort of in the wrong order, or maybe you didn't know exactly what was going on when you first formed the LLC. The absolute most common mistake that I see in LLC formations and structures is the operating or company agreement. You formed it on your own as a DIY formation, and either it doesn't exist at all, or it's just some random template found on the internet. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't go over the actual agreement between the two owners or multiple owners. It doesn't take into consideration things like contribution of assets, profit and loss, voting, what happens if someone's not contributing time, what happens if someone's not contributing money, or the infinite number of other issues that tend to pop up when you have a business partner or multiple owners. And the templated operating agreements or no operating agreement just means that you have no way to deal with this, and you end up in court, which is really bad, and it's really expensive for everyone. And a lot of times it can jeopardize the existence of the entire business. The next big DIY mistake that I see is people adding owners just randomly. They decide they want to make their buddy an owner or their employee an owner. They don't properly document anything. They don't properly report anything. And it ends up being just a mess that ends up in court and costs everybody a lot of time and money. So a few others, these are a little bit on structure and these are a little bit more on documentation side, but some of the common pitfalls that I usually see are people that filled out the documents wrong, and now they don't understand how the entity works. They don't understand the structure or the management of the entity. They've listed someone as a registered agent that's not the registered agent anymore, or they don't even know what a registered agent is. They're ignoring or missing filing their annual compliance reports, like their Texas Public Information Report, or a big one, and sort of a structured thing, but sort of an operations thing. They commingle personal funds and business funds, which is a big, big no-no. The thing that you need to keep in mind here is that structure is very important. It's also very complicated. And then discipline with your documentation, both when you're forming and then after you form, with your state filings, with your accounting, with your money, with your bank. All of these things are very, very important to be disciplined in, because you could just jeopardize the business and potentially even your personal assets if you mess this stuff up. Finally, on the flip side, what are the advantages if you do this right on the front end? You have proper planning and proper structure. Well, it's going to make sure that you've got the best tax situation possible because you've selected the right tax treatment for yourself. It's going to make sure that the owners and the company have liability protection in place. It's going to make sure that there's a very clear agreement between the owners that covers everything that could possibly come up and deal with any issues that may arise. It reduces internal fights, internal struggle. It helps manage in a more clean and efficient way. And then, of course, having all your documentation clean and well prepared means that if you ever decide you're going to exit, if you're going to sell this entity, it's going to be much more attractive to a buyer. And also, you won't have a ton of legal work to fix the entity before you sell it. So if you're forming a new entity, or if maybe you've done a DIY formation and you're not sure if you did it right and you need an audit, I recommend reaching out to a local business attorney. If you'd like to know more information about me or the law firm, go ahead and check the description below. Now, if you're thinking about forming an LLC, we talked about it just briefly in this video. One of the questions that you need to be able to answer is, what is your tax treatment going to be? Obviously, I always recommend getting a CPA, but there are a lot of things that can kind of go into that. And most people don't really know the difference between the tax treatments, and they don't even know that the S Corp tax treatment is even available to an LLC. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the S Corp tax treatment and whether your LLC can take advantage, please check out my other video.